Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 30th of January of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with Ugledar, with the battle for Ugledar. The Russians continue storming of this town, not just this town, but the vicinity of this town as well. There are few fortifications in this area. For now, the Russians have established control just over two of them. The south one is the residential area between Pavlovka and Nikolaevka, and another, Nikolskoye, my bad, and another one, the Russians entered the residential area that located on the east from Ugledar. I'm not sure about 100% control over this area, but as you can see, the Russian sources has been updated, and according to this update, we see that the Russians control just the south part of this residential area, and the north part is in the gray zone. As you can see, the Russians continue storming, and for now, there are no big progress or significant result in this process. I'm not saying that the Ukrainians are able to hold these positions. I'm just trying to say that the Russians are not going to count the losses, and they're not going to count the price they pay for this bridgehead. Furthermore, when talking about the Russians and their plans, as you can see, now the Russians try to develop the bridgehead around Ugledar. Let's return back to the Western sources map. As you can see, this map has been updated. In the previous versions of this map, the Russians were controlling just the central part of Pavlovka, and the western part was under Ukrainian control. And now, as you can see, the bridgehead has been updated, the Russians in this area. So at least when talking about today, about these hours and so on, the Russians try to attack Ugledar from the west. They're trying to develop their offensive operation in direction of the salt mine, or coal mine, and from the central part, they are still trying to establish their positions in the residential area that's located on the east of Ugledar to create 100% control. And furthermore, the Russians try to attack the Ugledar from the west as well, trying to encircle. So this is the Russian directions of their attack and so on. When talking about the Ukrainians, today we received the first information of the fact that the Ukrainians were forced to move to deploy their reserves of 1st Tank Brigade. If you take a look at the deployment map, you're gonna see that there are, when talking about Ugledar itself, there are 3 brigades in this area: 108th Defense Brigade, 68th Jaeger Brigade, and 72nd Mechanized. When talking about Ugledar itself, we can say that on the east side, in this area, when the Russians are from the west side, there is a 108th Brigade. Ugledar itself is under protection of 68th Jaeger Brigade, and 72nd Brigade mainly were located between Ugledar and Salt Mine number 7. In this area. So this is area of responsibility of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. And when talking about Tank Brigade, the Ukrainians deployed this Tank Brigade in this area on the north, and by short attacks from this area, they're trying to attack the Ukrainians, the Russians from the south, from Nikolskoye, and they're trying to pin down them and not allow them to develop their offensive operation. When talking about the Russian situation is critical, today the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the Ukrainians were forced to deploy this 1st Tank Brigade in this area, and that there were some kind of tank battle between the Russians and the Ukrainians in this area. But when talking about this report, the Russians didn't mention about any losses of Ukrainians of any tank during the previous 24 hours. That means that Ukrainians uses their tanks pretty successful. It is very difficult for the Russians to get them. Furthermore, today the Russians published or added some kind of icon in the vicinity of Ugledar showing the process of tank duels from the Ukrainian side. And the thing is that these towns like Ugledar and the town like this coal mine is on the hill. And when talking about the area behind Ugledar, this area is in the lowland. And the Ukrainians try to use blind positions to attack the Russians. So the Ukrainians attacks the Russians from the area that located behind Ugledar. They're in the lowland, and that's why the Russians are not able to see these tanks. And usually the Ukrainian forces who are located in these buildings, in high buildings, using the position on the hill, they try to navigate and try to target the Russians, and to control the Ukrainian tanks. So that's why it is very difficult for the Russians to move further, because they're always under tank attack and they can't see the tanks. So when talking about let's say the head of DPR, Pushilin, this area is under his responsibility as the authority, the main representative. And he told that the Russians managed to develop some progress, that they managed to enter the east part of Ugledar. But I must say that now the situation is 50-50. When talking about the Ukrainians, they have lack of artillery, lack of tanks, lack of everything we can possibly discuss, but they have a very good position. And when talking about the Russians, they have a lot of manpower, they have a lot of artillery system. They're ruining this area heavily without counting anything, and this is the main source of Ukrainian losses. But from the other side, they can't move further because of a very weak position from their side. So this is the situation. And furthermore, now the Russians completely changed their focus from Ugledar, and these hours, these minutes, they're trying to do one thing. They're trying to establish control over this coal mine, this one, that located on the northeast from Ugledar, this one, because it is much more easier to establish control over this coal mine, because the territory is less, there are not much high buildings, and from the one side and from the other side, from this perspective, they will be able to cut supply of Ugledar from the north, from this area, and from that moment the Ukrainians won't be able to supply support, and they will be blocked completely, and we can start counting days before Ugledar is going to fall. Furthermore, if you take a look at the Institute of Study of War map, we're gonna see that there is a hill in this coal mine, and the level of this hill is 248 meters above sea level. So this is the highest position on this front line, and this is the reason why the Russians want to get control over this hill. Let's return back to the Russian source map. I'm talking about this hill, this landfill. So this is the highest place, and who controls this place control everything around these towns, maybe in the radius with 10 or maybe more kilometers. So this is the vital point, this is the focal point, and if the Russians are able to block, encircle, or take control over this point, they will be able to win the battle for Ugledar. And one more time, the Ukrainians deployed the 1st Tank Brigade. They tried to save, they tried not to involve this brigade since the beginning of the special operation, and now this completely fresh, completely fully blooded brigade were deployed in this area, and the story starts from the very beginning. And I'm not sure how long the Russians are able to hold this tempo of attack, hold this pressure. I believe they are able, but it will be, the price is going to be very high, I believe. So furthermore, when talking about the Russians soldiers and officers on the ground, you know that it's a crime to discuss the Russian losses and so on. So they're not doing this, they're not provide the real numbers and so on. But everybody, every single person on the ground from the Russian side, according to the military experts channels and so on, they're saying that the losses are very high and the price are very high of battle for Ugledar. So let's see what is going to be tomorrow. But when talking about today, the Ukrainians lost just 25 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and 4 artillery systems, 1 howitzer D-20, 2 howitzer D-30, and another howitzer Gvozdika in this area. So let's wait what the upcoming day is going to bring us about this bridgehead. When talking about Donetsk, the city of Donetsk, as you can see, the Ukrainians attacked this town heavily with artillery, and furthermore, today they started to use distance mining technologies one more time. If you remember, last time they were using this method just in the previous year, somewhere in autumn, and since that moment they haven't used this tactic anymore. But today they decided to start one more time to attack Donetsk with the distance method of mining or something like this. When talking about Marinka still haven't fallen. this town remains, or a part of this town remains under Ukrainian control. The Russians completely slowed down in this area. I believe that the next few days they will be forced to activate in this area, because they need to take some forces, to take some Ukrainian forces that were deployed on Ugledar front line. They need to take these forces and to force these forces to change their focus and to start fighting around Marinka, because forces in near Ugledar, they need help, and the only help that the Russians are able to do is to open another front line, even fake front line, somewhere in this area. And this is the only that the Russians are able to do, is to somehow to reduce the Ukrainians' power in this area. Now let's talk about Bakhmut. As you can see, there are also a lot of icons. If you remember, yesterday the Russians reported that they established control over Blagodatne. And according to this map, as you can see, the Russians haven't established control over the trenches that located on the west side of the town by the name of Dvurechne, Blagodatne, this railway station Sol. I'm talking about these trenches according to the Russian sources map. But if we take a look at the Western sources map, you're going to see that according to this map, these trenches, including Blagodatne, are under Russian control. And mainly, the Western source map made these conclusions just because of the fact that Ukrainians reported that during the day they managed to repulse the attacks in the vicinity of Vasyukovka, Nikolaevka, Razdolovka, and also there were reports and video confirmations that the Russians established control of Blagodatne. So I believe that that's why the Western source map made the conclusion that this territory is completely under Russian control. But there were no updates about establishing control over these trenches, so I believe that the Ukrainians still control this area. Or maybe they're, of course, I believe that they will be forced to step back, but for now we haven't received any updates of the fact that these trenches fell under Russian pressure or something like this. But anyways, you can see, according to this map, the situation for the Ukrainians in Bakhmut are very critical. And the thing is that the Russians these days, these hours, are storms the vicinity of Ivanovska, and I believe that maybe in a day or two this village will fall. Another important thing is that the Russians continue storming in direction of Paraskovyevka and Krasnogora. So let's update this map just to understand what the Russians are planning to do and what are they doing right now. So when talking about the thing that the Russians are doing right now, so we can say that the Russians are trying to establish control over Ivanovska, over this town, and to take control over this blue cloud. So this is the things that the Russians are planning to achieve exactly at this moment, these minutes and these seconds. The same situation we can say about the area around Krasnogor and Paraskovyevka. So the Russians are trying to establish control over this bridgehead as well. The area that located on the north of the road MO3, over this area. And as you can see, this is the plan of Wagner's in this area. It's like the first step. This first step have at least two directions. The first direction in direction of Ivanovska, and the second one in direction of Krasnogora, Paraskovyevka. If the Russians are able to do this, we can say about establishing, I believe, tactical encirclement, because from this very moment the Russians will be able to cut the only roads that Ukrainians have to support and supply Bakhmut. This is the first road. This road will be under real fire and even physical control from the forces located in Ivanovska. And when talking about this area, there are this road or these roads that goes to this line are not have a very bad quality. It's a local road during this period of a year. It's not very easy to use these roads. I believe that Ukrainians still uses them, but I'm not sure about the quality and about the loss of Ukrainians. But anyway, the Russians have already established fire control over this small cross, over this small part of this road. But if they are able to reach the MO3 road, then they will be able to establish even physical control by sending some commandos through the forest line and so on. And Bakhmut will be encircled. Bakhmut will be encircled. So this is the first step. The second step that the Russians are going to do as soon as they establish control over these two blue clouds, I believe that the Russians will try to develop their offensive operation along this canal, and they will stop on the line of the railroad, because railroad usually is some kind of barrier that you need time to cross. So and without if we are talking about some fast progress, they will try to develop their offensive operation in direction of the town by the name of Canal. This is the title of this town, and from this moment it will be a real cauldron and encirclement of Bakhmut. If you ask me whether the Russians are able to cross this road MO3, I believe they are able, but it's another barrier as a river, as a canal, as a railroad, and so on. So it always takes more time to take control over to cross such a road than just to move along fields and a forest. So if we are talking about, if we compare the town by the name of Canal and let's say Verkhovka over these two towns, I believe that it's likely that the Russians will try to move from the south in this area. But from the other side, when talking about this area, it's also a very nice place to develop their offensive operation if the Russians are able to cross this road. If the Russians are able to cross this road, it is much more easier to take these three towns like Oryechovo-Vasilievka, Dubovo-Vasilievka, and Verkhovka, because there are not much places where the Ukrainians are able to hold their position, hold their forces, and so on. Because when moving in direction of Canal, this small town, the Ukrainians do have their forces in Chasov Yar, and they will always attack the Russians in their flank across this canal. But so that's why from this perspective, movement in this direction is more difficult than movements in direction of these two villages on the north of Bakhmut. But when talking about the north movement, we see that there is a road MO3. So I believe that it's just a question of where the Russians will be more lucky, on the south or on the north, and they will develop exactly that direction where they are more lucky than in comparison together with these two front lines. Another movement, I see that the Russians these days they attack in direction of Stupochki, and this operation, this movement shows me and tells me that the Russians will try to develop their bridgehead around Stupochki and Pritechin as well. Furthermore, I will make like the global movements in this area. They will try to establish the front line along the railroad, and there were a number of updates, a number of reports during the previous days that the Russians were trying to develop their offensive operation in the area of Belagorod, Delivka. So this is also some kind of plan, and if the Russians are able to develop their offensive operation during Stupochki, Pritechina, they will be able to cut supply and support of Chasov Yar, or not to cut, but at least reduce this support. And from some perspective, it will block forces in Chasov Yar. It will force them to change their focus, or maybe it's some kind of preparation before next offensive operation or storm operation of Chasov Yar. So this about Bakhmut. As you can see, the situation for the Ukrainians in Bakhmut is very critical. They are not planning to give up until the Russians establish control over Ivanovska, or until the Russians establish control over the bridgehead around Krasnaya Gora. What the Ukrainians are planning to do next, we'll see. I'm not sure that the Ukrainians are going to step back, because, or maybe they will, so we'll see. These two towns will determine the situation in Bakhmut, Ivanovska and Krasnaya Gora bridgehead. When talking about the north area of Solidar, or the south Seversk front line, as you can see, the Russians attacked Vasyukovka. The Russians attacked Saka-Vanzeti. The Russians made few attempts to attack Razdolovka, Veselaya. So they're storming all over the front line, and of course, when talking about the global scope, they want to get as fast as possible in direction of Raya-Alexandrovka. So, and Raya-Alexandrovka is the focal point in this area, and this is the town that will give us the answer to the question whether the Russians are able or not to encircle forces in Siversk. For now, there are at least 15 kilometers to pass from Vasyukovka, but anyway, the Russians are very close, and anything might happen there, and the front line can be collapsed immediately by the pressure of Wagner's and so on. So as you can see, this might be possibly another cauldron in this area. So for now, I see at least 3 possible encirclements: Seversk, Bakhmut, and Toretsk, New York agglomeration. I'm not saying that the Russians, they will try to encircle Chasiv Yar as well, but for these purposes they need more time. They need to attack Chasiv Yar from the north, so it's like a very long story. But if the Russians are able to develop this bridgehead, I believe that they are able to encircle Toretsk and New York, and they will try to do this as well. When talking about the Donetsk area, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainian lost around 70 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles, and 3 artillery systems, 2 Grad systems, and another D-30 howitzer, and also the Ukrainian lost another raider in this area. Furthermore, today we received updates about the fact that Ukrainians are moving more and more reserves to Krasna Gora, to Chasiv Yar. Now, these days, they're trying to prepare another defense line in Chasiv Yar along the canal. So this is the Chasiv Yar, and they're trying to create something temporary defense line along this canal before they prepare or before they made regrouping of their forces on the line of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka. When talking about, also there was a few updates of at least from Ivanovsk, that some Ukrainian forces refused to follow the orders, and as we know, this is like a first ring of a bell. Every time the Ukrainians, some parts of Ukrainian brigades or forces refuses to follow the orders, in the next 24 hours we see that these areas are collapsed and the Russians entered this area, or something like this. So we can say that there was a first confirmation of such a fact in Ivanovsk. So I believe that maybe there is a very high risk that during the next 24 hours the Russians will be able to enter Ivanovsk and to cut the only best and the only nice road that connects Konstantinovka and Bakhmut. And this is going to be a really beginning of the collapse and encirclement, the cauldron of Bakhmut. When talking about Seversk front line, there are the same stories. The Ukrainians are trying to move in direction of Kremenaya. They're trying to make some regroups, and so on, without any movements from both sides. But the Russian sources are saying that they're moving in direction of Makeyevka, but also with a very slow amount of forces, without any. I believe they're trying to attack some checkpoints, and if they're able to take these checkpoints, they're taking them. If they're not, they're stepping back. So just a small regular activity on Kupiansk-Liman front line. And the Russians reported that as a result of clashes on the Kupiansk-Liman front line, the Ukrainians lost around 75 soldiers, something around 10 armored vehicles on the front line. Mainly the Russians were attacking the 14th, 92nd, 95th brigades in this area. Another interesting update are coming from Kharkiv area, from this area. There are no update on the map, but some sources are saying that during the previous 24 hours, the Russians made some kind of recon combat in the area of Ternova, and they managed to enter this town. And the Russians were trying to understand the defense, the position of the defense line in this area, and so on. Maybe that was some kind of some kind of practice for commandos, Russian commandos group in this area, or maybe that was a real recon combat before something huge in Kharkiv area. Because when talking about the head of NATO, Stoltenberg, today he reported and he said that the Russians are not planning to stop, the Russians are not planning to give up. Furthermore, the Russians still think, and the Russians are plans to establish control over entire Ukraine, not just over the east part, south part. The Russians are planning to take control over entire Ukraine. So anyway, that means that the Russians will be forced somehow one day to start moving in the direction of Kharkiv. Of course, they need more forces for this, and furthermore, not the Russians. The number of forces is not the main thing the Russians need to take control over Kharkiv or over any other town in Ukraine. The main thing the Russians need is to destroy, completely reduce till zero the Ukrainian army in Donbass. If the Russians are able to destroy this army, to encircle, to destroy, to take as much as possible prisoners of war, In this case, they will be able to pass through entire Ukraine without the barriers or problems. But if they're not able to destroy Ukrainian army, they will attack the Ukrainians all over the entire Ukraine. They will be stabbed back step by step, town by town, and every time the Russians will have a lot of losses and so on. So for me, it's obviously, if the Russians want to take control over entire Ukraine, first thing they need is to destroy entire Ukrainian army on Donbass, the most powerful Ukrainian part, from Velika Novoselovka to, let's say, Seversk. So this army, if the Russians are able to do this, they won't have any problems to take entire Ukraine. But until they can't do this, they won't be able to do anything or do any progress on the ground or something like this. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.